May 1944. The Kentish coast, England. Grey clouds hang so low over the testing grounds that it feels as though the sky itself has grown weary of war and descended to earth. Mud to the ankles, the smell of cordite mixing with the bitter salt from the channel. The wind carries the sound of distant artillery practice from somewhere inland, a rhythmic thunder that has become as constant as breathing. Rain threatens but hasn't yet fallen, leaving everything damp and cold, the kind of cold that seeps into bones and stays there. Beside a modest Willys MB Jeep, its olive drab paint already peeling after 2 years of service, stands a cluster of men in drenched uniforms. But this Jeep no longer looks like itself. Welded to its rear frame are 12 metal tubes, each angled toward the sky at 55 degrees. It looks absurd, almost comical. Pipe organ on wheels. The playful ingenuity of mechanics transformed into something more, something deadly. A young ordnance officer, Lieutenant James Connor, 26 years old, his face still boyish beneath the helmet, pulls a cigar from his breast pocket. He doesn't usually smoke, but today his hands are trembling. Not from fear, from that sensation of standing at the edge of something new, something that might change everything. Or kill you. The cigar is Cuban, given to him by a Navy officer in Portsmouth who'd gotten it from God knows where. Connor had been saving it for victory, but this feels like victory enough. The moment before you find out if your crazy idea will work or blow you to pieces. He lights it with a Zippo that has Detroit scratched into the case. Takes a drag, feels the smoke harsh in his lungs. He nods once, sharp and decisive. Sergeant Billy McGregor, a mechanic from Detroit who assembled Fords on the line before the war. His hands perpetually stained with grease no amount of scrubbing can remove. Presses the ignition button. The world explodes. 12 4.5-inch M8 rockets tear from their rails in a sequence lasting 3 seconds but feeling like eternity. The sound isn't an explosion. It's a roar, primal and unstoppable. As if the earth itself is screaming in rage and terror. White smoke erupts in a massive cloud that engulfs the Jeep completely. Fiery arrows carve through the sky, leaving trails of smoke that twist in the wind like the fingers of giants. The Jeep shudders violently, rolls backwards several feet despite the brakes locked and wooden blocks wedged under the wheels. The canvas top ignites immediately. A hungry fire that someone quickly beats out with a rain poncho, cursing and laughing simultaneously. The ground vibrates underfoot. The air pressure changes, becomes thick, pushes against eardrums. When the smoke finally clears, blown away by the channel wind, the men stand in absolute silence. Someone laughs, high-pitched and nervous. Someone else mutters, "Jesus Christ," like a prayer. Connor stares at the Jeep. The frame bent slightly, paint charred black in places. One tire deflated from the concussion, but fundamentally intact. Whole, functional. And somewhere half a mile from here, on a hillside marked with white flags for targeting, the earth has been thrown upward by 12 craters, each one deep enough to hide a man. It works. Insane, dangerous, magnificent, but it works. McGregor walks slowly to the Jeep, running his hands over the frame like a doctor examining a patient. He finds the stress fractures, the places where the metal has begun to fail. "We need to reinforce here, here, and here," he says, pointing. His voice is steady despite the adrenaline. "Double the frame thickness. Maybe add cross-bracing. And we need better mounting points for the tubes. These welds won't survive more than a dozen launches." Connor nods, still tasting cordite in the air. Around them, the other engineers and officers are already talking excitedly, voices overlapping, pointing at the Jeep and the distant impacts. Plans forming. Modifications suggested. The spark has been lit. Thus was born an idea that would change the future of warfare. But the road to this moment was long and winding, paved with failed experiments and dead ends, and the road after it would be blood red. A trail of innovation and sacrifice that would stretch from the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, from the beaches of the Pacific to the rubble of Germany itself. 2 years earlier, in the winter of 1942, the war was going badly. Catastrophically, if you were honest about it, and most officers weren't. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore had fallen. The North African campaign was a grinding stalemate where Rommel seemed to dance around Allied forces like a boxer toying with an amateur. The Soviet Union was bleeding white at Stalingrad. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost to U-boats. And in Washington, in the Pentagon's labyrinthine corridors where strategy was born and died in equal measure, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department was facing a crisis of imagination. Traditional artillery was magnificent. The 105mm howitzer was a masterpiece of engineering, accurate, reliable, devastating. But it weighed over 2 tons. It required a truck to tow it, a crew of 6 to 8 men to operate it, precious minutes to set up and aim, and once positioned it was vulnerable to counter-battery fire. The modern battlefield was fluid, chaotic, fast-moving. By the time howitzers were aim-placed and ready to fire, the target had often moved or the tactical situation had changed entirely. Infantry needed fire support that could keep pace with tanks, that could dash forward, unleash hell, and withdraw before the enemy could respond. Mobile firepower.
Fast firepower.
Firepower that didn't require an engineering degree to deploy. The answer, when it came, wasn't from the technical schools or the proving grounds. It came from desperation and observation. Someone, and history would never quite agree on who, the kind of innovation that seems obvious in retrospect but radical at the time, looked at the M8 rocket being used by fighter aircraft and asked a simple question: what if we fired these from the ground? The M8 was a beautiful piece of simplicity. 4.5 inches in diameter, 33 inches long, weighing 38.5 pounds, carrying a 4.3-pound high explosive warhead. It wasn't accurate. Aircraft fired them in salvos and hoped for the best. It wasn't powerful compared to artillery shells. But it was light, it was cheap to manufacture, and when you fired a dozen at once, accuracy became less important. Saturation.
Shock.
Terror. The Wehrmacht might laugh at one rocket missing its target, but 12 rockets turning a city block into a moonscape? That inspired a different kind of respect. The experiments began quietly in 1943, tucked away in testing facilities in Maryland and New Mexico, far from the front lines where the real war was happening. Engineers mounted single M8 rockets on various platforms, trucks, half-tracks, stationary launchers. The results were mixed. The rockets worked technically, but the platforms were either too heavy, too expensive, or too slow. Then someone, probably a sergeant or corporal whose name never made it into official reports, had the idea that would change everything. What about a Jeep? The Willys MB was ubiquitous, cheap, fast, could go anywhere. It was the symbol of American military mobility. Every unit had them. Mechanics knew them inside and out. Parts were everywhere. If you could mount rockets on a Jeep, suddenly you had mobile artillery that cost a fraction of traditional systems and could be operated by a crew of 2. The official Ordnance Department looked at this proposal and saw problems. The Jeep's frame wasn't designed for the stress. The backblast would be dangerous to the crew. The accuracy would be terrible. The whole concept seemed reckless, the kind of thing that would kill more Americans than Germans. But wars aren't won by caution, and by late 1943, as planning for the Normandy invasion intensified, the High Command was willing to try anything that might give them an edge. A small team was assembled at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, given 3 months and minimal budget, told to make it work or abandon the concept. Leading the team was Major Harold Stevenson, a West Point graduate who'd taught mechanical engineering before the war and had a reputation for unorthodox thinking. His second-in-command was Captain Marcus Webb, a former racing mechanic from Indianapolis who'd built and crashed more cars than most men would see in a lifetime. Together with a crew of enlisted men, most of them plucked from motor pools and maintenance companies, they set out to turn a Jeep into a weapon. The first prototype was a disaster. They welded 8 M8 tubes directly to the Jeep's rear frame, angled at 45 degrees, and ran electrical wiring from the dashboard to igniters in each rocket. The theory was sound. The execution nearly killed them. During the first test fire in January 1944, with Stevenson standing 100 yards away behind a concrete barrier and Webb crouched beside the Jeep with a remote trigger, all 8 rockets fired simultaneously instead of in sequence. The blast was so powerful it flipped the Jeep onto its side, shattered the rear axle, and sent shrapnel flying in every direction. Webb was thrown 10 feet and broke his collarbone. The rockets, miraculously, flew relatively straight and impacted the target area, but nobody was celebrating. Stevenson visited Webb in the medical tent that evening. "We need to sequence the firing," Webb said through gritted teeth, his arm in a sling. "And we need to triple the frame strength. That thing tried to kill me." Stevenson nodded. Back to the drawing board. The second prototype was better. They built a custom frame reinforcement, essentially a cage of steel welded around the Jeep's rear section, adding nearly 300 pounds but distributing the stress. They redesigned the ignition system to fire rockets in pairs with half-second delays between each pair. They added a remote trigger with a 50-foot cable so the crew could fire from behind cover. In February 1944, they tested it again. This time the Jeep stayed upright. The frame held. The rockets flew. The only casualty was one of the rear tires, which blew from the concussion, but that was fixable. Stevenson sent his report up the chain of command with a single recommendation: proceed to field trials immediately. This system has potential. But field trials would have to wait because something unexpected happened. Word of the rocket Jeep experiments leaked out to the thousands of American troops staging in England for the invasion. Not through official channels, but through the military's most efficient information network. Gossip. Mechanics talked to other mechanics. Engineers swapped stories in pubs. Someone saw photographs. Someone else heard about the test that flipped the Jeep. And suddenly, across southern England, in dozens of motor pools and maintenance depots, young American soldiers began building their own versions. Nobody ordered them to. Nobody authorized it. They just did it because that's what Americans did: saw a problem, figured out a solution, improvised with what they had. Some welded crude tube mounts to Jeep frames. Others built elaborate wooden platforms. One innovative sergeant in the 29th Infantry Division created a system using salvaged German rocket tubes captured in North Africa, adapted to fire American M8s. It was chaos, beautiful and terrifying chaos, and by April 1944, the Army brass realized they had a phenomenon on their hands. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Assistant Division Commander of the 4th Infantry Division, encountered one of these improvised rocket jeeps during an inspection tour in Devon. The vehicle was parked beside a maintenance shed. Tubes mounted at angles that made no engineering sense. Wiring that looked like spaghetti. The whole thing covered in hand-painted shark teeth. Roosevelt, who'd stormed San Juan Hill with his father in 1898 and knew something about American ingenuity, asked to see it fire. The corporal who'd built it, a kid from West Virginia named Danny Perkins, explained nervously that they'd only test-fired it once, that it probably violated about 17 regulations, that he'd understand if the general wanted it dismantled. Roosevelt smiled, that famous Roosevelt grin. "Son, I want to see it shoot." They loaded 6 rockets. Perkins drove the Jeep to an empty field, positioned it facing a hillside half a mile away, and climbed out slowly. His hands were shaking. Roosevelt stood beside him, totally calm, as if they were discussing the weather. Perkins triggered the ignition. The rockets screamed away in sequence, 2 seconds of fury, impacts marching up the hillside in a perfect line. When the smoke cleared, Roosevelt clapped Perkins on the shoulder. "How many of these can you build before June?" Perkins blinked. "Sir, I don't know, Roosevelt interrupted. "Find out. I want every unit in my division to have access to one. Whatever you need, you tell my quartermaster, and he'll get it. This is going to save lives." Perkins stood there, stunned, as Roosevelt walked away. 2 weeks later, Perkins was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of a workshop with 12 men and orders to produce rocket jeeps as fast as humanly possible. Similar scenes played out across England. The Ordnance Department, seeing they couldn't stop the field modifications even if they wanted to, decided to embrace them. In May 1944, they issued Technical Bulletin TB ORD 325, which provided basic guidelines for mounting rocket systems on Jeeps. Minimum frame reinforcement specifications, safe firing procedures, recommended crew positioning. It was a remarkable document, essentially the U.S. Army admitting that soldiers in the field were innovating faster than the bureaucracy could keep up, and choosing to support them rather than shut them down. Attached to the bulletin was a warning. These systems are experimental and inherently dangerous. Crews volunteer at their own risk. Volunteers weren't hard to find. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, there were an estimated 40 to 60 rocket-equipped jeeps scattered among the assault divisions, though exact numbers were impossible to determine because many weren't officially documented. They landed on the beaches in the second and third waves, drove up from the killing grounds into the Hedgerows, and immediately proved their worth. The Hedgerows of Normandy, those ancient earthen walls covered in vegetation that divided every field into a natural fortress, were a nightmare for conventional warfare. Tanks couldn't see over them. Infantry couldn't advance without walking into ambushes. Artillery was too slow to respond to the constantly shifting front lines. But a rocket jeep could race up to a hedgerow, unleash a salvo that turned the other side into hell, and withdraw before German mortars could zero in. It was imperfect. Rockets went wild, hit trees, exploded prematurely. But it was fast, and speed was everything. Private First Class Robert Vance, 2nd Infantry Division, kept a journal that survived the war, now held in the National Archives. His entry from June 14, 1944, 8 days after D-Day. We're stuck in this goddamn hedgerow country and every field is the same. Advance 50 yards, get pinned down by a machine gun you can't even see, wait for artillery that takes 20 minutes to arrive. Repeat. Yesterday we got a rocket jeep attached to our company. Driver was a corporal from Texas, name of Rodriguez. He had this beat-up jeep with 10 tubes welded to the back. Looked like something a kid built in shop class. Germans had us pinned in a sunken road. Machine gun in the hedgerow maybe 150 yards ahead. Rodriguez just drove up, cool as you please, swung the jeep around, and lit off those rockets. Sound like freight trains. The hedgerow exploded, actual chunks of earth flying through the air. When we advanced, we found the machine gun crew dead, 3 of them, and blood trails leading away. Rodriguez drove off without saying a word. We took the field in 10 minutes. That jeep probably saved 20 lives. I hope Rodriguez makes it through this war. Rodriguez didn't. He died 3 weeks later when his jeep took a direct hit from an 88mm shell during the battle for St. Lo. The rockets cooked off in sequence, and there wasn't enough left of him to bury. But his contribution, and the contribution of hundreds like him, was undeniable. The rocket jeeps became legends, talked about in the same breath as the Rangers who scaled Point du Hoc or the paratroopers who held St. Mireglisse. They were symbols of American adaptability, proof that you didn't need perfect equipment, you needed smart people willing to take risks. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports captured after the war showed that Wehrmacht officers were initially baffled by these weapons. One report from July 1944, written by a German major in the 352nd Infantry Division, described American light vehicles equipped with multiple rocket projectors, capable of saturating large areas with high explosive. The psychological effect is severe. The sound alone causes panic among inexperienced troops. Recommend immediate countermeasures. But countermeasures were hard to develop when you couldn't predict where the rocket jeeps would appear or how they would be used. They struck from unexpected directions, fired rapidly, and vanished before counter-battery fire could respond. They were ghosts, deadly ghosts. As July turned to August and the Allies broke out of Normandy in Operation Cobra, the rocket jeeps moved with the vanguard. The breakout was chaos. Tanks racing through gaps in the German lines, infantry following in trucks, supply lines stretched to breaking. Traditional artillery couldn't keep up, but jeeps could. They moved with the infantry, sometimes ahead of them, providing fire support during the rapid advances and desperate skirmishes that characterized the race across France. One commander in the 3rd Armored Division requested 12 rocket jeeps be attached to his column during the drive toward Paris, using them as mobile harassment weapons to hit German positions along the roads. "They're not accurate enough to destroy hardened targets," he wrote in his after-action report. "But they're perfect for making the enemy keep their heads down while we maneuver." The fear factor alone is worth the logistics burden. The logistics burden was real. Each M8 rocket weighed nearly 40 pounds, and a jeep typically carried between 8 and 16, meaning hundreds of pounds of explosives bouncing through the French countryside on vehicles designed to carry troops and supplies. Accidents happened. One rocket jeep in the 1st Infantry Division hit a pothole at speed, dislodging a rocket from its tube. The rocket's fins scraped against the frame, creating a spark, and the warhead detonated. The explosion killed the driver and passenger instantly and wounded 3 soldiers in a truck behind them. The incident led to new regulations about securing rockets and speed limits for loaded vehicles, but enforcement was inconsistent. War doesn't wait for safety protocols. The crews themselves developed their own culture, a weird mix of bravado and superstition. They painted their Jeeps with names like Sudden Death, Thunder Run, Fireworks, and Barely Legal. They painted kill marks, 1 mark for every mission survived, not enemies killed, because survival was the real victory. They refused to carry certain numbers of rockets. 13 was universally avoided, and some crews insisted on even numbers only. They performed rituals before launching, crossing themselves, kissing photographs, touching lucky charms. Captain Morris Green, a chaplain with the 9th Infantry Division, wrote home about blessing a rocket jeep before a mission. I felt like I was blessing a bomb. The corporal who drove it, a Methodist boy from Georgia, held his rosary, borrowed from a Catholic friend who'd been killed the week before, and asked me to pray for accuracy. Not for safety, for accuracy. These boys have accepted they might die. They just want to make it count. By September 1944, the Ordnance Department had officially designated 2 systems for production: the T-27 xylophone, an 8-tube launcher for Jeeps, and the T-40 whiz-bang, a 20-tube system for 2.5-ton trucks. Neither were perfect. The T-27 was still prone to frame failures, and the T-40 was so heavy it made the trucks dangerously top-heavy. But they were standardized, which meant parts, training, and maintenance could be organized properly. Several hundred were produced and shipped to Europe in time for the fall campaigns. But the field-modified versions continued to proliferate because soldiers didn't trust that official equipment would arrive when needed, and they'd rather build something themselves than wait for the supply chain. This drove the Ordnance Department crazy. They couldn't ensure quality control, couldn't track maintenance, couldn't guarantee safety. But they also couldn't deny the results. The rocket jeeps and trucks were working, saving lives, changing battles. Then came the Hürtgen forest and everything changed. The Hürtgen forest was hell. 50 square miles of dense woods along the German-Belgian border. Ancient trees packed so close together that sunlight barely reached the ground. Ravines and ridges that made every advance a nightmare. The Germans had fortified it with bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions that commanded every approach. The battle lasted from September 1944 to February 1945, and it consumed entire divisions. The trees burst from artillery fire, sending splinters the size of spears through the air. The mud was bottomless. Men froze to death in foxholes. The forest became a graveyard where American units went to die. And in this hell, the rocket jeeps found their greatest test and their greatest tragedy. The problem was the terrain. Jeeps needed relatively open ground to maneuver and fire. The Hürtgen forest had no such ground. Every path was narrow, hemmed in by trees exposed to ambush. Crews tried to adapt, positioning their jeeps on the few roads and clearings available, but they were sitting ducks. German observers on the ridges could see them coming. German mortars and 88mm guns had pre-sighted coordinates. The rocket jeeps started taking heavy casualties. One company in the 28th Infantry Division lost 3 rocket jeeps in a single day, all to artillery fire. The crews died before they could launch a single rocket. The survivors refused to take the jeeps into the forest anymore. They'd park them on the roads leading in and walk forward to call for fire, then sprint back to launch and retreat. It was better than nothing, but it wasn't what the jeeps were designed for. Sergeant First Class Thomas "Tommy" Sullivan from Boston, a rocket jeep commander with the 4th Infantry Division, volunteered for a mission that everyone knew was suicide. A German strongpoint on a ridge was shelling American positions relentlessly, and conventional artillery couldn't get the right angle to suppress it. Someone had the idea to drive a rocket jeep up a logging trail that switchbacked up the ridge, get within 200 yards of the strongpoint, and hit it with everything they had. Sullivan and his driver, Private Eugene Mills from Oregon, loaded 16 rockets, every tube they had. They drove up the trail at night, headlights off, navigating by moonlight filtering through the trees. German patrols were everywhere. 3 times they stopped, engines off, listening to German voices pass within feet of them. When they reached a clearing below the ridge, they could see the strong point above, a concrete bunker with machine gun slits, barbed wire, the works. They positioned the jeep, aimed by eye, and Sullivan whispered to Mills, "On 3, we fire and run. Don't wait, don't look back. Just run." Mills nodded. Sullivan counted. 1, 2, 3. 16 rockets launched in 8 seconds. The night exploded into orange daylight. The trail lit up like noon. Sullivan and Mills abandoned the jeep and ran downhill as fast as they could, not looking back, hearing the rockets impacting above them, hearing secondary explosions, ammunition cooking off probably. They made it about 50 yards before German mortars started falling on the trail, massive explosions that threw them both to the ground. They crawled the rest of the way down. Took them an hour, reached American lines bleeding and deaf but alive. The next morning, scouts reported the strong point was destroyed. Bunker collapsed. Gun crews dead. The mission was a success. The jeep, predictably, was obliterated by German fire within minutes of the launch. Sullivan received the Silver Star. He never drove a rocket jeep again. "I used up all my luck," he told the chaplain. "That mountain should have killed us 10 times over." As autumn turned to winter, the Allied advance stalled. Supply lines were overstretched. The Germans regrouped. And then, in mid-December 1944, the Wehrmacht launched its last great offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. 3 German armies smashed through the Ardennes, creating a bulge in the American lines, surrounding entire units, pushing toward the Meuse River. It was the worst crisis the Americans faced in Europe, and it would be the rocket jeep's finest and most desperate hour. The Bulge was fought in snowstorms and sub-zero temperatures, through forests and villages, in conditions that broke men and machines with equal cruelty. Rocket jeeps and trucks became crucial because they were the only fire support many isolated units had access to. Traditional artillery was either cut off or bogged down in the snow. One legendary account, never fully verified but repeated in multiple after-action reports, describes a platoon from the 101st Airborne Division holding the town of Bastogne with 2 rocket jeeps as their only heavy weapons. Surrounded by German forces, low on ammunition, the platoon commander ordered the jeeps to fire on pre-planned coordinates around the town's perimeter, creating walls of explosions that convinced the Germans the Americans had more artillery than they actually did. The deception worked long enough for the weather to clear and reinforcements to arrive. Whether the story is entirely accurate or embellished by time, it captured a truth. The rocket jeeps were as much psychological weapons as physical ones, tools for creating chaos and fear out of proportion to their actual destructive power. The cold was brutal to the vehicles. Engines wouldn't start. Batteries died. Rocket igniters failed. Crews learned to sleep with the batteries in their sleeping bags to keep them warm, to run engines every hour through the night to prevent them freezing, to wrap the rocket tubes in canvas to protect them from ice. One corporal in the 7th Armored Division wrote in a letter home, "We spend more time maintaining the jeep than fighting. But when it works, when those rockets fly, it's like we're gods throwing lightning. Then we go back to freezing our asses off and praying the engine starts tomorrow." Private Daniel Kowalski, a 19-year-old driver from Chicago, kept the most detailed personal account of rocket jeep operations during the Bulge. His diary, donated to the Smithsonian by his family after his death in 1998, provides a raw, unfiltered look at life in these units. Entry from December 23, 1944. "Christmas is in 2 days and we're stuck in some Belgian village I can't pronounce. Germans are everywhere and we've got 1 rocket jeep between 40 guys. Yesterday we fired at a German column moving through the valley below us. 10 rockets, all we had left. I think we hit a truck, maybe a half-track. Hard to tell through the snow. The recoil cracked the frame again. 3rd time this month. Me and Sarge spent 4 hours in the dark welding it back together. Fingers so cold we couldn't feel them. I kept thinking about Christmas at home, Mom's cooking, Dad's awful jokes. Funny what you miss. Not the big things. The small things. If I make it through this, I'm never complaining about being bored again." Kowalski survived the Bulge. He died in a traffic accident in 1998. His family found his diary in a box in the attic, along with photographs of a soot-covered jeep with rocket tubes mounted on the back, parked in snow, and a younger version of their father standing beside it, smiling despite everything. By January 1945, the German offensive had been stopped, then reversed. The Allies pushed back, slowly, painfully, through the same ground they'd lost. The rocket jeeps moved forward with them, now operating in numbers. The Ordnance Department had shipped over 200 T-27 and T-40 systems to Europe by this point, and field modifications added perhaps another 100 improvised launchers. They became a normal sight, no longer experimental or shocking, just another weapon in the arsenal. This normalization brought both benefits and costs. Benefits: standardized training, better maintenance, more reliable supply of rockets. Costs: the loss of that wild, innovative energy that had birthed them. The rocket jeeps were now part of the system, which meant they were subject to all the system's inefficiencies and bureaucracies. The push into Germany in early 1945 saw rocket jeeps used extensively in urban combat, a role they were never designed for but adapted to out of necessity. In cities like Cologne, Aachen, and countless smaller towns, the jeeps would position themselves at intersections, fire salvos down streets to suppress German positions, then race away before Panzerfaust teams could respond. It was deadly work. The urban environment gave defenders too many angles, too many hiding places. Rocket jeep losses in urban combat were nearly triple those in open country. But the alternative, sending infantry into buildings without fire support, was even worse. One mission that became legend involved Sergeant Carl Zimmerman, a veteran rocket jeep commander from Milwaukee, and his driver, Corporal James "Jimmy" Wong from San Francisco. In March 1945, their unit was tasked with supporting an infantry assault on a German-held factory complex outside Essen. The factory was a fortress, concrete walls, machine gun nests, German soldiers who'd been ordered to fight to the death. Traditional artillery had pounded it for days with minimal effect. Someone suggested using rocket jeeps to get close, hit the defenders from unexpected angles. Zimmerman volunteered, but only if he could plan the approach himself. He studied the terrain, found a drainage ditch that ran within 150 yards of the factory, deep enough to hide a jeep if you drove carefully. At dawn, he and Wong loaded 12 rockets and drove down into that ditch, moving slowly, branches scraping the canvas top, water splashing up from puddles still frozen at the edges. They reached a position where they could see the factory's eastern wall. Zimmerman aimed, breathed deeply, whispered "now or never," and fired. 12 rockets in rapid sequence, 3 seconds of concentrated violence. The factory wall disappeared into smoke and dust. Secondary explosions followed, ammunition stores, probably, or fuel. Zimmerman and Wong were already reversing out of the ditch, engine screaming, when German machine guns opened up. Bullets sparked off the jeep's hood, shattered the windshield, punched through the canvas. Wong took a round through the shoulder but kept driving, one-handed, teeth gritted against the pain. They made it back to American lines, the jeep riddled with holes, Wong bleeding heavily but alive. The infantry assault went in behind the rocket barrage and took the factory in 2 hours. Zimmerman carried Wong to the medics himself, refused to leave until he knew his driver would survive. Wong recovered, sent home in April with a Purple Heart. Zimmerman stayed until the end of the war, drove his rocket jeep all the way to Czechoslovakia, survived without a scratch. 50 years later, at a division reunion, someone asked him how he'd done it, how he'd survived when so many others died. Zimmerman shrugged. Luck. That's all war is. Luck and trying not to waste the luck you're given. The Pacific Theater had its own rocket jeep story, though less documented and less celebrated. The terrain, jungles, mountains, beaches, was even less suitable for jeeps than European forests, yet Marines and Army units still experimented. On Okinawa in April 1945, Marine units improvised rocket launchers using captured Japanese equipment combined with American M8 rockets, creating hybrid weapons that Marine Captain Richard Steele described as the Frankenstein monster of ordnance. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. The sudden barrage from unexpected directions, the sound of rockets echoing through valleys, created an impression of overwhelming American firepower. One Marine lieutenant wrote, "The Japs are terrified of our rockets. They call them screaming demons. Good. Let them be scared. Every bit of fear we can create is one less Marine who dies taking a position." But the cost in the Pacific was heavy. The humidity ruined electrical systems. The terrain destroyed vehicles. Rocket crews faced not just enemy fire but disease, heat exhaustion, and the constant struggle to keep equipment functional in an environment that seemed designed to corrode metal and rot everything else. One rocket jeep crew on Luzon in the Philippines lost their vehicle not to combat but to a river crossing gone wrong. The jeep's weight distribution with rockets loaded made it top-heavy. It rolled in the current, and both crewmen drowned before anyone could reach them. Their bodies were recovered 2 days later, still strapped into their seats. The war killed in 1,000 ways, and sometimes the weapon you trusted killed you just as dead as the enemy. As the war in Europe ground toward its conclusion in April and May 1945, the rocket jeeps began to fade from the front lines. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, resistance sporadic, the need for experimental weapons diminishing. Many units stripped the rocket tubes from their jeeps, converting them back to transport vehicles. The tubes were left beside roads, rusting monuments to a brief era of innovation. Some were shipped back to depots for evaluation. Most were simply abandoned. The T-27 and T-40 systems were officially withdrawn from service in June 1945, deemed too dangerous and unreliable for peacetime military use. The men who'd crewed them were scattered, sent home, transferred to occupation duty, assigned to new units preparing for the invasion of Japan that never came. The rocket jeeps, those beautiful, deadly improvisations, became footnotes in after-action reports and stories told in VFW halls. But the idea survived. The innovation survived. Through the Cold War years, military engineers revisited the concept, studying the wartime experiences, learning from the failures and successes. The result was the M270 multiple launch rocket system, developed in the 1980s, a tracked vehicle mounting 12 rockets in armored pods, guided by computers capable of striking targets with precision. Decades later, the M142 HIMARS emerged, high-mobility artillery rocket system, mounted on a 5-ton truck, GPS-guided, lethal at ranges the World War II crews could never have imagined. These modern systems trace their lineage directly back to those muddy test fields in England, to those desperate mechanics welding tubes to jeeps, to Lieutenant Connor lighting his cigar before the world exploded. The military historians will catalog payload capacities and circular error probabilities and doctrinal evolution. But the real story is simpler and more human. It's about men who looked at a problem and said, "What if?" It's about the kid from Detroit who knew engines, the sergeant from Tennessee who knew welding, the lieutenant from Ohio who knew they were running out of time. It's about the moment when desperation meets ingenuity and produces something that changes the world,